A woman in rural Pennsylvania kept her adult sons locked in a state of infancy for over 3 decades, forcing them to breastfeed 4 times daily until they were gray-haired men in their 50s. When authorities finally tried to separate them, both brothers nearly died from the psychological trauma. This is a story of how maternal love became the cruelest prison ever built, and freedom meant death. Before we dive into the story, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to this channel, because tomorrow we're bringing you another story that will shake you to your core. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what's the most disturbing family secret you've ever heard about. Now, let's continue with the story. The autumn wind carried an unusual chill through the Allegheny Mountains on that October evening in 1854, when Reverend Isaac Thornhill first heard the whispers. He had been traveling through western Pennsylvania for 3 weeks, bringing scripture to isolated communities that rarely saw outsiders, when a woman named Martha Grissom pulled him aside after Sunday service. Her hands trembled as she gripped his sleeve, her voice dropping to barely more than a breath. She spoke of the Caldwell property, a farm deep in the forest where something unholy lived, where grown men cried like babies in the night, and where a woman with eyes like coal ruled over darkness itself. Martha begged him to investigate, to bring God's light to whatever evil had taken root in that place, but she refused to accompany him, crossing herself repeatedly and backing away as if merely speaking the name Caldwell had invited damnation. Isaac spent 2 days asking questions, piecing together fragments of rumor and fear. The Caldwell family lived 5 miles into the mountains, along a path that barely deserved the name road. A widow named Constance had raised her sons there for over 2 decades in complete isolation. Neighbors who had ventured close enough to hear sounds from the cabin spoke in hushed, horrified tones about what reached their ears. Grown men speaking in baby talk, a woman's harsh commands followed by whimpering obedience, strange rhythmic sounds that suggested activities no one wanted to name. Most disturbing were the sobs, desperate and primal, the kind of crying that came from souls trapped in torment beyond description. As Isaac guided his horse up the mountain path that October afternoon, fog rolled through the trees like grasping fingers. The forest grew darker, denser, as if nature itself recoiled from what lay ahead. Then he saw it, a sagging cabin with smoke rising from a crooked chimney, windows like dead eyes staring out from a face of rotting wood. And from inside came sounds that froze his blood, grown men crying, begging, calling for Mama in voices thick with desperation and terror. Isaac's hand trembled as he knocked on the warped wooden door. The sounds inside ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, and when the door finally creaked open, Isaac found himself staring into eyes that seemed to hold nothing but calculated coldness. Constance Caldwell stood barely 5 feet tall, her body thin as a winter branch, but she radiated an authority that made Isaac instinctively step backward. Silver hair hung in tangled ropes past her shoulders, framing a face carved deep with lines that spoke of years spent scowling. She wore a stained gray dress that might have been black once, and her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "What do you want?" Her voice scraped like rusted metal. Isaac introduced himself, explaining he was visiting families in the area, offering spiritual guidance and fellowship. Constance's expression never changed, but something flickered in those black eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or contempt. "We don't need your God here, preacher. We have everything we need." Before Isaac could respond, a sound came from deeper in the cabin that made his stomach turn. a grown man whimpering, followed by another voice joining in, both pleading in childish tones that didn't match their clearly adult pitch. "Mama, please, we've been good. Please, Mama." Constance's head snapped toward the sound with predatory speed. "Hush now, boys. Mama's talking to a visitor." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. Isaac glimpsed movement in the shadows behind her. Two massive figures huddled on the floor near a cold fireplace, their shapes too large to be children, yet positioned like toddlers awaiting permission to move. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw their faces, weathered and lined, beards streaked with gray, eyes wide with a fear so profound it seemed baked into their very bones. "Are those your sons?" Isaac asked, though he already knew the answer. "My precious boys, Silas and Tobias." Constance turned slightly, revealing more of the cabin's interior. "They need their mama. Always have. Always will." That's when Isaac saw it. Constance's dress hung open at the chest, one withered breast partially exposed, and on the floor near her feet was a crude wooden stool worn smooth by decades of use. The pieces fell together in his mind like a puzzle, revealing an image too horrific to accept. "How old are your sons, Mrs. Caldwell?" Her smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "Old enough to know they can't survive without me. That's all that matters." One of the men, Silas perhaps, began rocking back and forth, his arms wrapped around himself. "Mama, is it time? Please, Mama, we need—" "I said hush!" Constance's voice cracked like a whip. Both men flinched violently, pressing themselves against the wall. She turned back to Isaac, her face serene again, as if the outburst had never happened. "As you can see, preacher, my boys require constant care. They have a condition, a special need that only their mother can provide. Now, unless you're here to help with that, I suggest you leave." Isaac stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. These weren't children. These were grown men, probably in their 50s, cowering before a woman who held them in a grip that transcended any chain or lock he'd ever seen. Isaac didn't leave. Instead, he returned 3 days later with food and medicine, using the pretense of Christian charity to gain access to the cabin. Constance accepted his offerings with suspicious eyes, but allowed him inside, perhaps enjoying an audience for her dominion, or simply confident that no outsider could threaten her control. What he witnessed over the following week shattered every assumption he held about the boundaries of human behavior. The brothers followed a rigid schedule that revolved entirely around their mother. At dawn, both men would wake and immediately crawl to where Constance sat in a wooden rocking chair, positioning themselves on either side like supplicants before a cruel deity. She would nurse one while the other waited, trembling with anticipation, sometimes for over an hour. The ritual repeated at midday, again at dusk, and finally at midnight, each feeding lasting until Constance decided it was finished. Between these sessions, the brothers existed in a state of infantile dependency that defied their physical forms. They spoke in fragments, using words a 5-year-old might choose. "Mama, hungry. Mama, cold. Mama, need you." Constance dressed them each morning in shirts she had sewn, buttoning them herself, while the brothers stood motionless. She cut their food into tiny pieces and watched as they ate, correcting their manners as if they were toddlers learning to use a spoon. Isaac tried speaking with Silas alone when Constance left to fetch water from the well. "How long has this been happening?" he whispered urgently. Silas looked at him with eyes that held no comprehension of the question's meaning. "Mama takes care of us. Always has. We can't live without Mama's milk. Doctor said so. What doctor? Mama told us. The doctor said if we stop, we'll die. Our bodies need it. We're special. Isaac's heart sank. Silas, you're a grown man. Your body doesn't need— No! Silas's voice rose to a panicked shriek. You don't understand. We'll die. We'll die without Mama. He began hitting himself, his fists pounding against his own chest until Constance rushed back inside. She gathered Silas in her arms, rocking him, while shooting Isaac a look of pure venom. See what you've done, trying to poison his mind with lies. My boys know the truth. They know what happens to children who leave their mother. What happens? Isaac asked quietly. Constance's smile returned, cold and terrible. They disappear, like their father. Like anyone who tries to take them from me. The world devours them, preacher. Only Mama's love keeps them safe. That night, Isaac couldn't sleep. He lay in the small guest room Constance had grudgingly provided, listening to sounds that haunted him. The brothers slept in the same bed as their mother, one on each side. And through the thin walls, he could hear them crying softly in their sleep, whimpering for comfort that never came. Once, he heard Tobias wake and beg for an extra feeding, his voice thick with an addict's desperation. Constance's refusal was followed by sobbing that lasted until dawn. But the detail that truly chilled Isaac came from something Silas mentioned in passing. Mama says our brother Caleb was weak. That's why he's gone now. We won't be weak like Caleb. A third son, one who wasn't here. Isaac decided he needed to find Caleb, because whatever truth existed in this nightmare, that missing brother held the key to understanding how something this monstrous could exist. Isaac left the Caldwell cabin the next morning with a single mission: find Caleb. He spent 2 weeks following whispers and rumors through mining towns and logging camps, asking about a man who had fled the mountains 15 years ago. Most people gave him blank stares or suspicious glances, but in a tavern outside a coal mining settlement, a bartender's eyes flickered with recognition at the name. Caleb Caldwell? Yeah, I know him. Goes by Caleb Warren now. Works the night shift at the mine. You'll find him here around 8, drinking until he can't remember his own name. When Caleb walked into the tavern that evening, Isaac recognized the family resemblance immediately. The same broad shoulders, the same dark hair, though Caleb's was streaked with premature gray. But where Silas and Tobias moved with the uncertain shuffle of children, Caleb carried himself like a man who had survived a war. Isaac introduced himself, mentioning the Caldwell property. Caleb's face went pale, his hand tightening around his whiskey glass until his knuckles turned white. I don't talk about that place. Your brothers are still there, still under her control. Caleb downed his drink in one swallow, signaled for another, then looked at Isaac with eyes that held decades of pain. Then they're already dead. Their bodies just don't know it yet. Over the next 3 hours, as the tavern emptied and dawn approached, Caleb spoke. His words came haltingly at first, then faster, as if a dam had finally broken inside him. He described how it started after their father died in 1829. Constance had gathered her 3 sons together, the oldest barely 16, and told them the world had killed their father because he had ventured too far from family. She began the extended nursing that same week, claiming it would protect them from the same fate, that her milk contained special properties that would shield them from danger. At first, it was just before bed, Caleb said, his voice hollow. Then twice a day, then 4 times. By the time I was 10, my brothers were 20 and 18, and they were still nursing like infants. She convinced them they'd die without it, that their bodies were different, that they needed her. The psychological torture went deeper. Constance destroyed any letter that arrived from distant relatives, claiming they were trying to trick the boys into leaving so they could steal the family property. She told elaborate stories about children who disobeyed their mothers and were found dead in the forest, their bodies torn apart by wild animals. She made them recite prayers, thanking her for keeping them alive, for loving them enough to protect them from the evil world. "What about you?" Isaac asked. "How did you escape?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "I was the youngest. Maybe that saved me. I still had enough of my own mind left to recognize that what she was doing was wrong. When I was 17, I ran. Middle of the night. Just ran until my legs gave out. She sent Silas and Tobias after me, but they couldn't function alone. They got lost 2 miles from the cabin and had to turn back." "Did she punish them for failing?" "She withheld nursing for 3 days. Silas told me later, before I left, that those 3 days felt like dying. That's when I knew they were gone, really gone. She'd rebuilt their minds so completely around needing her that separation became physical agony." Caleb leaned forward, his eyes boring into Isaac's. "Whatever you're planning, preacher, forget it. You can't save them. They'll fight you harder than she will." Isaac refused to accept defeat. Armed with Caleb's testimony and his own observations, he traveled to the county seat and demanded an audience with the magistrate. What followed was a battle against an entire system that had no framework for understanding the horror he described. Magistrate Howard Billings listened to Isaac's account with growing discomfort, shifting in his chair as the preacher detailed what he'd witnessed. When Isaac finished, Billings steepled his fingers and sighed deeply. "Reverend, what you're describing is certainly unusual, but I fail to see the crime. These are adult men living with their mother by choice." "By choice?" Isaac's voice rose. "They've been psychologically imprisoned since childhood. They believe they'll die without her." "Belief isn't illegal. Many people hold unconventional views about health and family. Unless you can prove she's physically harming them, she's destroyed their minds. They function as infants in the bodies of 50-year-old men." Billings rubbed his temples. "I understand your concern, but Pennsylvania law protects family privacy. A mother's authority over her household, even adult children who choose to remain, is not something we interfere with lightly." Isaac spent the next week consulting with 3 different physicians, dragging them through rain and mud up the mountain path to examine the brothers. What they found baffled them. Physically, Silas and Tobias were reasonably healthy despite poor posture and vitamin deficiencies. But their mental state defied medical understanding of the era. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the most educated of the 3, attempted various tests. He asked Silas to count to 100. Silas made it to 12 before looking panicked and asking for his mother. He showed Tobias a simple written passage. Tobias could barely recognize his own name. When Pritchard suggested the brothers might benefit from living independently, both men became hysterical, screaming that the doctor was trying to kill them. "It's as if their mental development was frozen in early childhood," Pritchard told Isaac afterward. "I've never seen anything like it. The mind is capable of being shaped, especially through prolonged trauma or conditioning. But this level of regression in adults? It shouldn't be possible." Yet it was. And now Isaac had documentation, witness statements, medical evaluations. He returned to Magistrate Billings with a stack of papers and a renewed determination. This time, Billings couldn't dismiss him. The weight of evidence, the testimonies from 3 respected physicians, and Isaac's relentless pressure finally produced results. After consulting with county officials, Billings issued an order for Silas and Tobias Caldwell to be temporarily removed from their mother's custody for comprehensive medical evaluation and potential treatment. Isaac felt a surge of hope as he rode back toward the mountains with Billings, 2 deputies, and Dr. Pritchard. They would save these men, break the chains of twisted maternal control, give them a chance at real life. He had no idea he was about to witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. When they arrived at the cabin, Constance stood in the doorway as if she'd been expecting them. Her face showed no surprise, no fear, just that cold, knowing smile. "You've come to take my boys," she said quietly. "We have a legal order, Mrs. Caldwell," Billings announced. "Your sons need proper medical care." Constance's smile widened. "Then take them. But know this, preacher. You're not saving them. You're killing them." She stepped aside, and what happened next would prove her words more prophetic than anyone wanted to believe. The moment the deputies stepped inside to collect Silas and Tobias, hell erupted in that cabin. Both brothers exploded into violence that shocked everyone present. Silas, despite his childlike demeanor, possessed the strength of a desperate animal. He launched himself at the nearest deputy, fists swinging wildly, screaming in a voice that seemed torn from his very soul. Tobias grabbed onto the doorframe with both hands, his fingers turning white from the pressure, howling like a creature being dragged to slaughter. "Mama! Mama! Don't let them take us! Please, Mama!" Constance stood perfectly still, her arms crossed, watching the chaos with those dead black eyes. She said nothing, did nothing, but her presence seemed to amplify her son's terror. Isaac swore he saw something pass between them, some wordless communication that made both brothers fight, even harder. It took all Dortquatch to pry Silas away from the deputy he'd tackled. The brother thrashed and bit, drawing blood, his face contorted into a mask of pure panic. Tobias had to be forcibly removed from the doorframe, his fingers leaving gouges in the wood. As they were finally dragged toward the wagon, both men were sobbing uncontrollably, reaching back toward the cabin where their mother stood silhouetted in the doorway. "You're killing us! You're killing us! We need Mama! We'll die without Mama!" The journey down the mountain was a nightmare. Silas and Tobias were restrained, but continued thrashing, their cries echoing through the forest. They begged, they pleaded, they screamed until their voices went hoarse. By the time they reached the medical facility in town, both men had collapsed into whimpering heaps, their eyes glazed with shock. Dr. Pritchard established them in a clean room with 2 beds, proper food, and medical attention. Isaac felt a flicker of hope. Surely, given time and care, the brothers would begin to see that life existed beyond their mother's control. That hope died within hours. Silas refused all food. When nurses tried to feed him, he turned his head away, tears streaming down his face, mumbling that only Mama's milk could nourish him. Tobias accepted water, but nothing else, rocking back and forth on his bed, with his arms wrapped tight around his torso, recreating the position he'd spent decades in while nursing. By the second day, both men had developed fevers that medical examination couldn't explain. Their bodies showed no signs of infection or illness, yet they burned with heat that soaked their bedsheets with sweat. They stopped responding to questions, stopped acknowledging anyone's presence except to occasionally whisper their mother's name. On the 3rd day, Silas tried to hang himself using strips torn from his bedsheet. A nurse found him just in time, his face already turning purple, his eyes bulging. When they cut him down, he didn't seem relieved to be alive. He seemed angry that they'd stopped him. Tobias had stopped speaking entirely. He sat in the corner of the room, staring at nothing, occasionally making sucking motions with his mouth, as if nursing from an invisible breast. When Dr. Pritchard tried to examine him, Tobias didn't resist or acknowledge the touch. He simply continued his phantom nursing, lost somewhere inside his own shattered mind. Isaac watched through the door window, his heart breaking. These weren't men recovering from trauma. These were men dying from separation, their entire sense of self so intertwined with their mother that removing her presence was like removing vital organs. On the fourth morning, Dr. Pritchard pulled Isaac aside, his face grave. "If we don't return them, they'll be dead within a week." The decision to return Silas and Tobias to their mother felt like admitting defeat against an enemy that couldn't be seen or fought. Magistrate Billings made the call on the fifth day, after Silas had attempted suicide a second time, and Tobias had stopped drinking water entirely, his lips cracking and bleeding from dehydration. "We cannot force them to live," Billings said, his voice heavy with frustration. "And we cannot watch them die in our care. God help us, but they're going back." The return journey up the mountain was eerily silent. The brothers, weak and trembling, seemed to sense where they were going. As the wagon climbed higher and the familiar forest closed in around them, both men began to cry softly. But this time, the tears seemed different. Not terror, but relief. The relief of addicts finally returning to their poison. Constance stood waiting in the exact same spot where she'd watched them leave 5 days earlier. Her expression hadn't changed, that knowing smile still playing at her thin lips. When the wagon stopped and the deputies helped her sons down, both men collapsed at her feet, grabbing at her skirts, pressing their faces against her legs. "Mama, Mama, we're sorry. We're so sorry. Please don't punish us. Please, we need you." She looked down at them with something that might have been love in another person, but in her eyes looked more like ownership. Her gnarled fingers stroked their hair as they wept. "Mama's here now. Mama forgives you. Come inside, boys. It's time." Isaac watched as Constance led her sons into the cabin, one hand on each of their shoulders. At the doorway, she turned back to face the men who had tried to intervene. "I told you," she said simply. "They're mine. They've always been mine. And they always will be." The door closed, and through the grimy window, Isaac saw Constance settle into her rocking chair. The brothers immediately assumed their positions on either side, and the ritual that had been interrupted for 5 agonizing days resumed as if it had never stopped. Isaac returned to the cabin 3 days later, unable to leave things as they were. What he found was worse than before the intervention. The brothers had regressed even further, their eyes now holding a hunted, desperate quality. They flinched at sudden movements, spoke even less than before, and clung to their mother with an intensity that bordered on mania. Constance greeted him at the door, that perpetual smile wider than ever. "Come to check on your handiwork, preacher? See what happens when you try to destroy a family? I was trying to help them." "Help?" Her laugh was like breaking glass. "You showed them what happens when they disobey. You proved that the world wants to hurt them, that only Mama keeps them safe. You made them more mine than they've ever been." She was right, and Isaac knew it. The failed rescue had become a weapon in her arsenal, proof of every lie she'd ever told them about the dangers beyond her control. "How did this start?" Isaac asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you do this to them?" Constance's eyes glittered with something ancient and cruel. "I didn't do anything to them, preacher. I simply never let go. Most mothers make the mistake of releasing their children into the world. I learned better. Love means never letting them leave. Love means making them need you so completely that your absence becomes death itself. She closed the door in his face, and Isaac heard the bolt slide home with terrible finality. Isaac couldn't abandon the case, even as it consumed him. He began investigating the Caldwell family history, digging through county records, and interviewing anyone who remembered the family before their isolation became complete. What he uncovered revealed how methodically Constance had constructed her prison. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, had died in 1829 during a logging accident. Nothing suspicious about his death. Witnesses confirmed a tree fell the wrong way, crushing him instantly. But what happened in the months following painted a disturbing picture. A woman named Prudence Scott, who had been friendly with the family before Thomas died, agreed to speak with Isaac in hushed tones over tea. "Constance changed overnight," Prudence said, her hands trembling slightly. "The day after the funeral, she gathered those boys and told them their father's death was a warning, that the world beyond their property was cursed, that it would kill them too if they ever left her side." "And the breastfeeding?" Prudence's face flushed with shame. "I saw it myself, 6 months after Thomas passed. I brought food to the family, neighborly kindness, and I walked in on her nursing Silas. He was 16 years old, nearly a grown man. When she saw me staring, she didn't look embarrassed. She looked defiant, told me her boys had delicate constitutions, that regular food made them sick, that only her milk kept them alive." "Did you tell anyone?" "Who would I tell?" Prudence's voice cracked. Her husband had just died. People thought grief had made her overprotective. And back then, family matters stayed private. You didn't interfere, even when something felt wrong. Isaac found more witnesses. A former schoolteacher named Vernon Ashford remembered trying to enroll the Caldwell boys in the local school in 1830. "Constance met me at her property line with a shotgun," Vernon said. "Told me her boys didn't need poisonous ideas from outsiders, that she'd teach them everything they needed to know. I reported it to the county, but nothing came of it. Parents had rights, even paranoid ones." The pattern became clear. Every attempt at intervention, every offer of help, every expression of concern was met with Constance's iron refusal. She systematically isolated her sons, telling them stories that transformed normal life into mortal danger. Isaac found a particularly damning piece of evidence in the county clerk's office. In 1835, a distant uncle had written to the county expressing concern about the Caldwell boys, requesting someone check on their welfare. The letter described rumors of unnatural arrangements and stunted development. But the county had done nothing, filing the letter away and forgetting about it. "We get complaints about families all the time," the current clerk explained when Isaac confronted him with the letter. "Unless there's evidence of physical abuse, we don't have authority to intervene. Eccentricity isn't a crime." But this wasn't eccentricity. This was calculated destruction of human potential, executed over decades with surgical precision. The most chilling discovery came from a journal Isaac found in the town's historical society. It belonged to a traveling merchant who had stopped at the Caldwell property in 1842. His entry for that day simply read, "Witnessed something at the Caldwell place that defies Christian understanding. 2 grown men, bearded and weathered, sitting at their mother's feet like toddlers, awaiting permission to breathe. The woman looked at me with eyes that held no soul. I will not return to that cursed place." The merchant had seen the truth 13 years ago. Like everyone else, he'd done nothing. Isaac made one final attempt to penetrate the fortress Constance had built around her sons' minds. He arrived at the cabin on a gray morning in November, carrying a letter from Caleb. The youngest brother had finally agreed to write to Silas and Tobias, hoping his words might spark some memory of a life before complete subjugation. Constance read the letter before allowing her sons to see it, her lips moving silently as her eyes scanned the page. When she finished, she looked at Isaac Yaw with amusement dancing in those dead eyes. "You brought my traitor son's poison into my home?" She held the letter over a candle flame, watching it curl and blacken. Caleb made his choice. He chose death over family. "He's alive and well," Isaac countered. "He has a wife, children, a life. He has nothing." Constance's composure cracked for the first time, her voice rising to a shriek. "He's a ghost, dead to this family, cursed for abandoning his mother." Silas and Tobias cowered in the corner, their hands over their ears, whimpering at the sound of their mother's rage. Isaac saw how thoroughly she'd trained them, how even her anger sent them into paroxysms of fear. But Isaac pressed on, desperate. "Silas, Tobias, your brother wants you to know there's another way to live. You could have families, work, freedom." "Freedom?" Constance's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Freedom to die alone and unloved? Freedom to be destroyed by a world that devours the weak? I protected my boys from that lie." She moved to her rocking chair, and immediately both brothers crawled toward her, their faces desperate. Isaac watched in horror as the feeding ritual began, Constance exposing her withered breast, while Silas positioned himself with the practiced ease of decades. Tobias waited his turn, rocking slightly, his eyes glazed. "This is protection?" Isaac's voice shook with rage and disgust. "This is love?" Constance stroked Silas's gray-streaked hair as he nursed, her expression serene once more. "This is the only love that matters. The love that never abandons, never betrays, never allows her children to face the world's cruelty alone. I am their beginning and their end, their sustenance and their salvation." Isaac tried one more approach. He knelt beside Tobias, waiting for his turn, and spoke directly to him. "Tobias, do you remember your father? Do you remember life before this?" Something flickered in Tobias's eyes, a brief shadow of recognition or memory. His mouth opened as if to speak, and for one breathless moment, Isaac thought he might have reached him. Then, Constance's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Tobias!" Just his name, nothing more, but the effect was instantaneous. Tobias's face went blank, that flicker of awareness extinguished as completely as snuffing a candle. He turned away from Isaac, resuming his rocking, waiting for his mother's permission to approach. Isaac stood slowly, defeat settling over him like a burial shroud. He'd failed. Not because Constance was too strong, but because her sons were too broken. She'd spent decades building a prison inside their minds, and the walls were too thick, too high, too reinforced by fear and fabricated need. As he walked toward the door, Constance called after him, her voice pleasant now, almost friendly. "Don't feel bad, preacher. You can't save people who don't want saving. My boys know where they belong. They'll be here with me until the day I die, and probably long after. Some bonds can't be broken, not by God, not by law, not by anything." The door closed behind him with terrible finality. 7 years passed like a slow death. Isaac moved on to other parishes, other communities, but the Caldwell case haunted his dreams and poisoned his faith in humanity's ability to protect its most vulnerable. He tried to forget, tried to convince himself he'd done everything possible, but the memory of those 2 gray-bearded men crawling toward their mother's breast never left him. Then, in 1861, a letter arrived that pulled him back into the nightmare. Constance Caldwell was dying. The letter came from a local physician who'd been called to the property by neighbors, who noticed smoke no longer rose from the cabin's chimney. Dr. Marcus Weatherby wrote in clinical terms about finding an elderly woman, now 79 years old, bedridden with pneumonia and barely conscious. But his final paragraph carried a note of horror that transcended medical detachment. The sons refused to leave her side for even a moment. They lie in the bed with her, one on each side, still attempting to nurse from a woman who can barely draw breath. I fear what will happen when she passes, which I estimate will occur within days. I thought you should know, given your previous involvement with this family. Isaac rode through a winter storm to reach the cabin, arriving to find the door unlocked and hanging open. Inside, the temperature was barely warmer than outside. The fire had died days ago, and the smell of sickness hung thick in the air. He found them in the bedroom, exactly as Dr. Weatherby had described. Constance lay in the center of the bed, her breathing shallow and rattling, her skin the color of old parchment. On either side, Silas and Tobias pressed close to their mother, their arms wrapped around her wasting body, their faces buried against her chest. They were both in their late 50s now, their beards fully white, their bodies gaunt from what looked like weeks of not eating. They didn't acknowledge Isaac's presence, didn't move except to maintain their positions against their dying mother. Isaac approached slowly. "Silas? Tobias? You need to eat something. You need to let the doctor help her." No response. It was as if he didn't exist. He tried again. "Your mother is dying. You need to prepare yourselves." "No!" Silas's voice was barely a whisper, his face still pressed against Constance's chest. "If Mama dies, we die. We'll follow her. Can't live without Mama." Tobias made a sound that might have been agreement, a low keening that raised the hair on Isaac's neck. Isaac spent 3 days at that cabin, trying desperately to convince the brothers to accept food, water, any form of care. They refused everything, existing in a state between waking and sleeping, clinging to their mother as she slowly slipped away. On the 4th day, as dawn broke cold and merciless, Constance Caldwell took her final breath. Isaac was there, watching as the woman who had destroyed 3 lives finally released her grip on the world. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Silas lifted his head, looked at his mother's still face, and let out a sound that Isaac would hear in nightmares for the rest of his life. Not quite human, not quite animal. A wail of such complete desolation that it seemed to contain every moment of the past 50 years, every lost possibility, every murdered chance at a normal life. Tobias joined him, and their combined grief shook the walls of that cursed cabin. They weren't mourning a mother. They were mourning themselves, their minds, their stolen lives, everything they could have been, but would never be. Isaac tried everything to keep Silas and Tobias alive. He brought food, forcing spoonfuls of broth between their clenched teeth. He built fires to warm the frozen cabin. He pleaded, commanded, even prayed over them. Nothing worked. The brothers had stopped being separate people the moment their mother died. They moved in eerie synchronization, refused to be separated even for a moment, and communicated in a private language of whimpers and gestures that excluded everyone else. Most disturbing, they continued the nursing ritual with Constance's corpse. Isaac discovered this horror on the 2nd night after her death. He'd left the brothers alone for an hour, thinking they'd finally fallen asleep. When he returned, he found them positioned on either side of their mother's body, their faces pressed against her cold chest, making the sucking motions they'd performed for over 3 decades. "Dear God," Isaac breathed, pulling them away. "She's gone. She's dead. You have to stop this." Silas looked at him with eyes that held no recognition of reality. "Mama's sleeping. She'll wake up. She always wakes up. We just have to wait." Dr. Weatherby came daily, but his medical knowledge proved useless against whatever psychological mechanism was shutting down the brothers' will to live. Their bodies showed no illness, no injury, yet they were dying as surely as if they'd been poisoned. "I've never seen anything like it," Weatherby confessed to Isaac on the 5th day. "It's as if their minds are commanding their bodies to cease functioning. They're literally willing themselves to death." On the 7th day, Silas stopped drinking water. Tobias followed suit within hours. They lay in the bed flanking their mother's body, which Isaac had been unable to remove for burial because the brothers attacked anyone who tried to take her away. The cabin had become a tomb for 3 people, 2 still technically alive. Isaac sat vigil, documenting everything in a journal, compelled to create some record of this tragedy. He wrote about how the brothers held hands across their mother's corpse, how they whispered to each other in voices too low to hear, how they seemed almost peaceful as they faded. On the 10th day, Isaac found Silas dead. He'd simply stopped breathing sometime during the night, his hand still clutching his mother's cold fingers. Tobias stirred when Isaac checked for Silas's pulse, his eyes opening briefly. "Silas found Mama," Tobias whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now I can go too. Tobias, please. Let me help you. Let me take you to your brother Caleb. You could still have a life." But Tobias had already closed his eyes again, a small smile playing at his lips. Isaac recognized that expression. It was relief. After 58 years of existence, Tobias was finally being released from a life that had been a prison from its very beginning. 11 days after Constance Caldwell died, Tobias followed his brother and mother into death. Isaac found him in the morning, lying in the same bed where all 3 had slept for decades, his arms wrapped around himself in a final, eternal embrace. The county buried all 3 in unmarked graves at the edge of the town cemetery, as far from consecrated ground as possible. The cabin stood empty, nobody willing to claim the property or the possessions inside. Locals whispered that it was cursed, that you could still hear the brothers crying for their mother on quiet nights. Isaac wrote his final journal entry that evening. "I witnessed the death of 3 people today, though 2 had been dead in every way that mattered for half a century. God help us all for the horrors we allow to flourish in the name of family." The Caldwell property stood abandoned for over 2 decades after the deaths. No one wanted land where such profound psychological horror had taken root. The cabin itself seemed to radiate wrongness, its walls still holding echoes of decades of twisted maternal control and destroyed lives. Local children dared each other to approach the property on moonless nights, though few made it past the tree line. They claimed to hear sounds drifting from the empty cabin, grown men crying like infants, a woman's harsh voice commanding obedience, the creaking of a rocking chair that no longer existed. Whether these sounds were real or products of guilty community conscience, no one could say for certain. Isaac returned to the site only once, in 1878, 17 years after the deaths. He was an old man now, his hair white, his body bent from years of carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. He walked through the cabin's remains, the roof partially collapsed, the walls rotting, nature slowly reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. In the bedroom where 3 people had died, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the wooden wall above the bed, in handwriting he recognized as Constance's, were words that seemed to summarize the entire nightmare. Love that binds is love that lasts forever. My boys will never leave me. Never. He understood then what had truly happened in this place. Constance hadn't just destroyed her son's ability to function independently. She'd destroyed their very concept of self, rebuilding their identities so completely around needing her that they ceased to exist as separate human beings. When she died, they died, because there was no them without her. The psychological mechanism she'd created was perfect in its cruelty. The extended nursing wasn't about nutrition or even control in the simple sense. It was about creating a physical dependency so profound that it rewired her son's brains, making separation from her feel like death itself. And she'd been right. Separation was death for them. Isaac learned that Caleb had died 2 years earlier, never having overcome the trauma of his childhood despite his escape. He drank himself into an early grave, his wife telling Isaac that he'd wake screaming most nights, calling for his mother, even though he'd hated her, with every fiber of his being. 3 sons, all destroyed by a woman who claimed to love them more than anything. 3 last consumed by maternal devotion, twisted into something monstrous. The cabin finally collapsed completely in 1882 during a severe storm. The locals cheered its destruction, hoping it would finally lay the ghosts to rest. The land remained empty, considered cursed, avoided by everyone who knew its history. But the real curse wasn't in the land or the cabin. It was in the minds of those who had known the truth and done nothing. The neighbors who heard strange sounds and convinced themselves it wasn't their business. The officials who prioritized family privacy over human welfare. The doctors who had no framework for understanding psychological abuse. The entire community that allowed horror to flourish because confronting it was too uncomfortable. Isaac died in 1885, taking with him detailed journals documenting the Caldwell case. His final entry reflected on what the tragedy revealed about the limits of love, the danger of absolute parental control, and how the strongest prisons are built not with walls, but with manipulation of the human mind and heart. The Caldwell story became a whispered warning in the region, a cautionary tale about maternal love taken to its most nightmarish extreme, where protection became possession and devotion became destruction that consumed everyone it touched. If this story disturbed you as much as it should, click that like button and subscribe. Because tomorrow we're uncovering another dark family secret that proves sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who claim to love us most. Drop a comment and tell us, what's the most toxic family dynamic you've ever witnessed? We'll see you in the next one.